Looks like we're live now, so we'll just give a few seconds for people to log on, and then I'll introduce our panel. And I'll also try to remember to keep track as we go along on participants. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to our session on women and work, macro policy, shocks, and the gendered nature of work. This is a co-sponsored panel. Our first sponsor is URPE, the Union for Radical Political Economics, and our second sponsor is IAFE, the International Association for Feminist Economics. We have 5 awesome papers, and we're going to learn so much. We have amazing speakers. So the format is that each speaker will present for 15 minutes, and I will jump in briefly with reminders verbally at 10 minutes and at 14 minutes. Participants who are attending today, if you can please put any questions or comments in the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time at the end for that. We do have some time also for discussants within the panel. And I've asked our panelists to repeat the question in the Q&A session. So let's just go straight to our first paper, which is by Randy Alvelda from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, who is speaking to us about a paper called Essential, Exposed, and Still Unequal, Women, Work, and COVID-19 in the US. Randy.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Anna, for chairing. You seem to be chairing all the sessions I go to, and you do a great job. So thank you. And thanks for whoever's out there. And I wish we could see each other. This is what I say in every class I teach. I wish we could see each other. This paper was actually hard to write in some ways because there's already a good bit of literature and data actually and analysis about what's gone on with women in COVID. A lot of that has focused on women's increased unpaid work burden. And there's also been a good bit of attention on the racial effects of COVID. And also, you know, I think for feminist economics purposes, this new word for us, essential workers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to think about it a little bit differently. And so it took me a long time to figure out how to frame thinking about COVID and gender. But, you know, feminist economics has a pretty good toolkit. And so reaching into the feminist economics toolkit, I decided to focus on reproductive labor and social reproduction, but reproductive labor in particular, family structure and state, and intersectionality. So what I'm going to do is talk about my framework, do a little bit of historical analysis of where we start when we get to COVID, with an argument that there was already growing and substantial inequality among women, and talk about how COVID-19 has exacerbated that inequality, and then talk about what to do. So most of what I'm going to do is actually going to focus on the impacts of COVID among different kinds of women in the United States. I know there's a lot of words on here, but the first thing I wanted to do was, I'm a big fan of Evelyn Glenn's work. I often use the same article of hers because I think it's really good. It's called From a Servitude to Service. And it's from 1992. And what she does is she takes socialist feminist theory at the time and critical race theory and argues about the racial division of reproductive labor. And she argues that that's a really important way to understand women of color in the United States. And so I'd like to resurrect reproductive labor. I think we've moved to this notion of care work, and I think it's subsumed by care work. And I like the way Mignon Duffy talks about that. She distinguishes between nurturant care, this face-to-face work that improves human capabilities, but also there's a whole slew of, and this comes out of a long tradition of socialist feminists economics, Heidi Hartman, Lourdes Benaria, but also women of color who are writing, like Evelyn Glenn, and now again in the global care chain work, is this notion of reproductive labor that includes non-nurturant care, like the work of cleaning up after people, making food, preparing. So there's both a paid and an unpaid portion of that. And Evelyn Glenn emphasizes the fact that women of color have been assigned that reproductive labor, which unfairly burdens women of color, but also serves to reproduce the subservient and dominant, racial relations between white women and women of color, in part because it allows white women to fulfill the other roles that they want to have, either in the home or in paid work. COVID has brought us this term essential workers, and I think what's really interesting about essential workers is that includes both the paid nurturant care, but also a part of this non-nurturant care. Public transportation, grocery stores, production, transportation of food. But a large group of non-nurturant care workers, that's why I think reproductive labor is such a good term for thinking about this, are also on the other end of the COVID spear. That is, those are also the same workers that are most likely to be unemployed because they can't work remotely. They're in hospitality, restaurants, and personal service. So reproductive labor, I think, allows us to understand both tips of that spear, and especially in communities of color where it matters so much if you have both large levels of unemployment and large levels of people exposed to COVID. So I say reproductive labor, bring it on back. And I think it's important because it really allows for a racial lens as well as a gender lens. Also too many words. The point here is that I think economists have argued, or maybe it's just me, have argued consistently that family formation matters tremendously for women's economic status, more so than, in fact, perhaps availability of paid labor, although that's changed a little bit over time. So women historically have been tied to male breadwinners, and their economic status has been tied to that, and the presence of children, particularly for white women. I think for women of color, women from other, and actually citizen status, I think, is becoming an increasingly really important nexus of power and inequality in the United States. So I've decided to focus a lot more on that in terms of my own analysis. It generates a different dynamic, but it has similar results, that time demands of children and insufficient earnings to support families mean that who you live with and whether you have children is really important factor in one's economic outcome. And also the role of the state is very much premised on women's relationship to their family. So in the United States, breadwinner wage replacement policies, in particular unemployment insurance, Social Security, paid time off, are more robust than other forms of income policies in the United States, but they're individually based and they're tied to standard employment relations, which male breadwinners, at least male breadwinners of the past, have. Anti-poverty policies are also there for when there's no breadwinner or nobody in the household that has reliable earnings. And those are all means tested based on your income. They're family-based, not individual-based. They're not very generous, they're stigmatized, and they require considerable documentation. This part of the story comes out later because COVID, throws a lot of people out of work. What's there to catch them? And the gendered nature and the racial nature of the state means there's differential access to state policies under COVID. And of course, intersectionality, it's been a long time staple to recognize this. I guess we could call it stratification economics, whatever it is that differences among women in particular matter a lot. And women of different kinds of status or in different groups or categories face different opportunities, both at the individual level and at the institutional level. And so I think both of these tools allow me to use intersectionality more. So the pre-COVID look, I'm only looking largely at income inequality among women, and mostly at family income, because that's the basis by which we can measure well-being. Doesn't include everything, but I've used the March, the annual social and economic supplement of the current population survey from 1968 to 2020, broken down by race and ethnicity, actually white, non-Hispanic, Black, and Latina, educational attainment, which is the closest thing we have in this data set to class. It's not very good, but citizenship, US born or born to US parents, whether you're naturalized or not a US citizen, marital status, presence of children, and of course, I'm particularly interested in looking at married versus single mothers. I don't know how well you can see these graphs. These are just the change in the demographics. So among women, over this large span of time, less white, more educated, less US born, less married, more childless, at least or children under the age of 18, and more single mothers. And I only look at women aged 25 to 54, largely because this is the group I think that is probably in some ways hit particularly hard in terms of employment and income of the group. And I did want to look at largely that group of women that were most likely to be employed and or most likely to have children. Here's the median family income. I know it's a lot of graphs, but white women, college educated, being married, being a US citizen, and if you're a married mother, confers higher family income. None of this is surprising. But what I'm actually pretty much interested in is what's happened in the distance between these lines. So, you know, this is white women. This is a college degree or an advanced degree. Here are naturalized, actually naturalized, women who are naturalized in the US have higher median family income than US born. These are married women. And then interestingly enough, there's hardly any difference overall between median family income of own children and not children. But if you look a little closer, that's changes quite a bit. So
Randy, you're at 10 minutes. You have 5 minutes left.
Oh boy, I guess I better move on. But this graph, I think the point of these graphs is to demonstrate that there's growing inequality, particularly among women with children in the United States. So all these graphs on the right-hand side of these 4 panels show that in some ways, especially by race and by college or class, if you will, that as these lines go down, that means the ratio is worse. And it's always bad for single mothers, by the way, down here. So moving on to COVID. And here I use the CPS data from March 2019 to 2020. This actually complements some of the other papers that have been presented early that I've seen, certainly Michelle's, Holder and Tom Masterton's work, and then the last session by Ofemama Blue and Derek Hamilton were looking at some of this stuff. So what do we see? These are employment to population ratios, and what's important here, I guess, are again the differences among these lines. Clearly, women with advanced degrees or college degrees have higher levels of employment initially, and they don't see their employment drop by much. Let me go, because I don't have that much time. Let me go to these are indexed, so you can see relative changes. These are indexed to I don't want to index them to January of 2020. So I indexed them to the full year. I averaged the year of 2019. They're not seasonally adjusted, but you get a sense of it. So in these graphs, what you see is Latino women, Black women face very steep falls in unemployment and not very strong recoveries compared to white women. Similarly, high school women with no more than a high school degree see their employment to population plummet, and again, don't recover very well. Women who are not US citizens similarly, and then interestingly enough, single mothers tend to have higher employment to population ratios, but they dive down deeper than married mothers and don't recover as well. So the usual suspects are doing usually bad. So COVID exacerbates the already a difficult situation. These graphs are a little hard to read, but this is where I think the social reproduction or the reproductive labor matters so much. This is the two tips of the spears. So the top lines, these dotted lines, are the percentage of women in each group that are in what are called frontline occupations. And I use CEPR's, Center for Economic Policy Research, definition of frontline workers. It includes construction workers, it includes grocery store workers, it includes transportation workers, healthcare workers. And then the bottom line is unemployment. And so this red line on top are the percentage of Black women that are frontline workers, and this red line on the bottom are the percentage that are unemployed. And so what you can see in these graphs is that these are the two tips of the spear. So Black women and Latino women are much more likely to be frontline workers, but they're also likely to be in groups that have high levels of unemployment, which of course is just, poison for communities of color. Similarly, one could see a very similar trend for women with some college or college degrees, very high levels of unemployment, high percentages of frontline workers. And then, finally, the group that the single mothers have much higher levels of being frontline workers and also higher levels of being unemployed compared to married mothers. So this notion of reproductive labor, I think, matters a lot because the reproductive labor or the face-to-face labor that couldn't be remote ends up being more highly unemployed, as well as having to be exposed and having to do quote unquote essential work, and often at low pay.
Randy, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, so let me skip the self-reported effects. They did ask some new questions. If you look at the extreme hardship, the pulse data, it all points to the same thing, that the same groups of women, women without college degrees, women who are Black or Latina, non-US citizens, and low mothers are faring comparatively worse. And what's out there for them? Well, the two things that are out there for all workers and all low-income families that have worked are UI, unemployment insurance, and SNAP, food assistance. And what we see with unemployment insurance is that it's spotty. It hasn't reached a lot of the workers that should. The best thing was the bump up. That was great, but the bump up's gone. And a lot of workers aren't covered. Non-citizens aren't covered by any of this stuff unless they've been at all. And if you are, you can be an immigrant in the United States and be here for 5 years legally and get any kind of anti-poverty assistance. So let me go quickly to what might we do. Well, first of all, I think a conceptual focus on the intersectional tools of analysis that we do have is important. I think the lessons of COVID is that well-being matters. We're not an economy, we're a society. That we need adequate, fair, and inclusive wage replacement and anti-poverty programs. They are in dire need of repair, and I hope that comes out of COVID. We still need to make bad jobs better, especially among paid reproductive workers without college degrees, and there's a whole litany of things that can happen with that. And then finally, I feel like a broken record. I think many of us do that high quality, flexible, universal childcare is still crucial. What's interesting is that public schools were kept open and funded, but childcare was not. And the United States has seen an erosion of its childcare infrastructure like it never has seen over COVID. And it's unclear if that can be rebuilt. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Randy. The evidence is crucially important. And, as are the policy recommendations. You also have some great sound bites in there. I hope you've been using them in interviews with the media. I especially like we live in a society, not in an economy. That's great.
I think I saw that on Twitter.
Oh, you did? Okay, it's good. It's very good. Next, we have Stephanie Seguino from University of Vermont, speaking on industrial policy and gender inclusivity. Stephanie, you are on.
Thank you. Can you now see my screen? Great. Hi, everybody. I wish I could see you, but great to see my colleagues who are on the panel. This is a paper that I was asked to write for a handbook of industrial policy that just came out. I want to say something about that in the end, but just to let you know that this is really part of a return to reconsideration of industrial policy after many years of neoliberal development policy that argues that the state does not have a significant role to play. And it really reflects the failure of neoclassical growth strategies in terms of raising living standards and supporting structural change, especially in developing countries. And so this is really a return to a past theme in which heterodox economists, macroeconomists, whether from Latin America or elsewhere, have argued that structural change is necessary for economic catch-up, and that industrialization is a key component of structural change that raises productivity and thus leads to rising living standards. And so it considers a very strategic role for the state as compared to the hands-off role that neoclassical economists often argue for. And so when we talk about industrial policy, it's really an articulated pathway to industrialization and the production of high-value added goods and services. And so a key question about that, and that I sought to try to answer in this chapter, was how to make industrialization gender inclusive. And what came up for me in writing this was really what we have learned as feminist macroeconomists, especially in the last 20 years, is that there are feedback loops. That is, that macro level policies affect gender equality, but gender equality also affects the success of macro level policies. And that is here true, and I'll try to outline that as much as I can in this period of time that I have. So want to just suggest this, that markets on their own don't ensure the benefits of industrialization are equitably shared. That is, you can structurally change an economy and still leave people behind, or in fact, as Diane Elson says, push them behind. And so one of the objectives of industrial policy ought to be to address specifically class, race, and gender inequality. And I will have to say that in the work that I've done on this, that there has been resistance to this issue, even amongst countries that embrace industrial policy and an interventionist role for the state. And by that, I mean countries whose governments I've spoken to who are, have sort of a deep role for the state, such as Vietnam and Ethiopia and some others. And so in many ways, feminist economists continue to have a lot of work to do to bring male heterodox economists into this discussion about the important role of gender. So in industrial policy, I want to just talk about a few of the channels by which it affects gender equality and why therefore it matters to explicitly address gender. Structural change, first of all, influences employment and wages. And it can be equalizing or disequalizing depending upon the type of job segregation that exists, unrelated to human capital. And whenever I talk about this, the male economists often go to the fact that women will be excluded from industrialization because of educational gaps. That is really no longer the case in most countries of the world. And even where it was, that's not the entire explanation. But in any case, industrial policy also, so it has an impact on women in terms of employment and wages, but it also influences innovation pathways that result in the creation of new industrial products that may meet the needs of some groups and not others. And the exclusion of women can in fact have a negative effect on the benefits of industrial policy in terms of the new products that are produced. I want to just talk briefly about work really that I did years ago, and work that that many of us on this panel have talked about, and that is that past experience with industrialization should teach us, in fact, that structural change based on industrialization, in fact, can be gender disequalizing and gender oppressive. And I think of that in regards to the semi-industrialized economies that massively incorporated women into manufacturing, but in a way that was consistent with growth, in the sense that women were segregated into export industries, low wage, labor intensive export industries, and that those low wages essentially substituted for currency devaluation as a mechanism to cheapen export goods, generating the foreign exchange that was needed to buy the technical, the capital goods and licenses and patents needed to move up the industrial ladder. but what I think many economists fail to identify, I guess I'm going to pick on neoclassicals right now, but you know, especially neoclassicals, who often argued that the fact that women were pulled into manufacturing was great, and that gender equality would emerge. But really what they failed to understand was that structural change in and of itself is gendered. And what we have observed is defeminization as countries move up the industrial ladder. So looking here at some work that that Alyssa and I have done with some other authors in various papers, and looking at the defeminization of manufacturing employment. And you can see here that these are the changes in women's relative concentration in the industrial sector over this period of time. And what's happened is that as countries move to more knowledge and capital intensive goods, women seem to be excluded from those jobs that are created in that process of structural change. And it should be, you know, I think what's worth noting here is that it's actually rapidly growing economies here in which we are seeing the worst effects of defeminization. So industrial policy on its own and structural change on its own is not necessarily going to benefit women. One of the things, of course, that has happened is that there have been declines in industrial employment over time, as you can see here, both for developed and developing countries. And what that does is it creates greater gender job segregation, competition for the fewer high quality jobs in the economy. And so I would say that there are two factors in women's declining share of industrial employment, both the process of premature deindustrialization that exacerbates gender job competition, and the other is stratification processes that lead to women's exclusion from these jobs, whether it is gender norms and stereotypes that saddle women with unpaid labor, but now in this new phase, a more recent stereotype that men are more suited to science and technology jobs than women. And I want to just point all of you who do this work to the work of Cecilia Ridgway, a sociologist who wrote a book called Framed by Gender. It's a great place where she summarizes her work. And what she says is that, you know, you would think, you know, we have gender norms and stereotypes associated with certain occupations, but you would think that as the economy changes and there are new occupations and old occupations disappear, that gender norms and stereotypes may not persist, because these are new jobs that are not yet inscribed with gender. But what she argues is that in fact, newly created jobs are themselves, occupations are inscribed with gender based on past associations with certain types of work. And I say this just very briefly in that it's a dynamic process. It's a very dynamic process by which newly created jobs become gendered and hierarchically gendered over time. And so there are supply side effects to these negative effects of industrial policy if they aren't addressed. And one of those is related to social reproduction. And this refers here, I'm going to refer to the work that Alyssa, I think, brilliantly advanced in her earlier papers, and some recent work that we have done on empirically testing the impact.
Stephanie, you went quiet all of a sudden. Do other panelists have trouble hearing Stephanie, or is it just my computer?
I can hear Stephanie.
Okay.
Okay, good. It's gonna go backwards here. Whoops. And so, so I want to talk about just very briefly these supply side effects. And I mentioned that some empirical work that Alyssa and I did with Lieve Altinger that empirically estimates the impact of social reproduction regimes on economic growth. And so one of the issues is that social reproduction, to the extent that women are included in new industrial jobs, that this improves the quality of the labor force. And in particular, it avoids the problem of the trade-off between women's paid work and unpaid caring labor that could dampen investments in children and long-run productivity growth. So countries that have very strong social reproduction regimes that recognize and redistribute it, again, referring to Diane Elson's terminology, are likely to do better than those countries that don't have strong social reproduction regimes. In other words, even if you include women in industrial production, if you solve the employment problem, if you haven't solved the social reproduction problem, you have a negative effect on long-run productivity growth because of the impact on children, in particular investments in children. And second of all, in terms of knowledge production, that is the inclusion of women, addresses the what might be called the selection bias problem, right? The overemployment of unqualified men and the underemployment of qualified women that also can weaken knowledge production in these sectors. I think I'm gonna,
you have 5 minutes left.
okay, great. So I want to just make reference then to this work with ASSA, in which there are 4 stylized social reproduction production regimes of mutual, time squeeze, wage squeeze, and exploitative. My paper is posted, so you can read in more detail, and of course the paper's with ASSA. But the point I want to make again is that these mutual regimes in which there is a strong social reproduction policies enable women to join the labor force at the same time without producing costs in terms of the reproduction of the next generation labor force in terms of productivity. And that those regimes that are built on exploitation, that is, that underpay women, that segregate women in low-paid jobs, and fail to provide for social reproduction needs, are those countries that grow slowly. So again, this is sort of the feedback relationship between industrial policy, what its impact is on gender, and the feedback effect from that to industrial policy. And so failure to acknowledge this component, especially social reproduction, could in fact undermine the success of industrial policy. I think I'm going to skip this. I want to just say a few words about gender and knowledge production. And I think that one of the things this was one of the areas that was new to me in researching this paper. And there's some really interesting research in terms of the role of gender in knowledge production, and especially in the unequal representation of women in STEM fields. So frequently it's argued that, you know, women just don't like science or don't like math. But the reality is that there's a lot of research shows that there are gender unequal norms and stereotypes that shape the attitudes of gatekeepers. And that by that, I mean professors, directors of research institutes, and so forth. And there's very strong evidence that that women, especially engineering students, but many others, experience bias as well as sexual harassment from faculty and staff. So it is a process of stratification, I would argue, that is excluding women from STEM fields, and that exclusion has important negative effects on knowledge production. There's a great deal of work on the role of diversity in organizations that promotes better output, better outcomes, I would say, for example, and then in particular that the composition of an organization impacts on its ability in problem solving, which is such a critical part of a knowledge intensive economy. And I just want to cite a couple of studies here. There's one study that talks about team diversity in open software development, which argues that it correlates positively with team output. So in other words, having mixed gender, mixed race teams is more successful than homogeneous teams. And also another study that I found interesting was that male and female engineers that collaborate with both genders are roughly twice as productive as measured by peer-reviewed articles and so forth. So finally, just one last point, exclusion of women also influences who benefits from technologies. There's some great work in a book whose title I can't quite remember right now, but perhaps somebody here can, on the types of products that are produced that use men as testers, and therefore we have products that in fact don't suit women's needs. So for example, virtual reality headsets, granted, I don't use one of those, but maybe some people do. Smart watches that are too big for women's wrists, many others, but also in the area of testing. Crash dummies in autos are typically male, and yet women are at higher risk for injury. Cardiovascular disease subjects are typically male, and yet it leads to the undertreatment of women. So in all regards, gender exclusion from industrial policy is problematic. Gender inclusion could promote greater success. And I want to just let you read some of this, but just tell you a little story that ASSA is aware of. And that is that the authors of this book started their project probably 3 years ago. But they had a workshop in April of last year with the authors, chapters already written, and suddenly realized gender had not been thought of, and contacted both of us to write a chapter on this. And that's an example of what shouldn't be done. That is, that gender should not be an afterthought, but has to be at the beginning of design of these policies. And I think that there are many mechanisms to do this. I've listed some here, but first acknowledging there are distributional effects of industrial policy, and you have to intentionally address them. And there are a variety of reciprocal control mechanisms that many countries have used, such as South Korea, that incentivizes private firms to align their goals with societal goals, including gender inclusion. I'll end it right there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for a really good presentation on industrial policy and gender. I liked your story at the end, and I can't believe they didn't think to include gender until much later. So I'm glad that you wrote this chapter. Let's see, and sorry I had to interrupt you. For some reason, my volume went silent, so I probably could have asked in the chat if that happened to anyone else. So let's turn now to Alyssa Bronstein from Colorado State University. And the paper she's presenting, a co-authored paper, is The Macroeconomics of Women's Economic Empowerment, a macro-micro analysis of gender segregation and job quality in developing countries. Alyssa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you can hear me, yes? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I feel like this, we're cheating a little bit, and that Stephanie and I were back to back. So it's sort of like we have 30 minutes for our presentation rather than just 15. So that's kind of fun. But I'll go into particular aspects of the kinds of issues that Stephanie was talking about in the last slide, and give you a preview of some of our work going forward. This particular project that I'm highlighting today is co-authored with Diksha Arora, who's here at CSU, and also Stephanie. And it's an extension of prior work that we've done over a few years. The most recent iteration is publication in Development and Change on the costs of exclusion, but we also contributed a chapter to the 2017 Trade and Development report through the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The first time that there had been an entire chapter devoted to gender in that report, which has been the longest running UN flagship report since 1981. So it reflects a little bit of the story that Stephanie closed in the last presentation. And this work focused on the macrostructural determinants of increasing gender job segregation, focusing on developing countries and taking a panel approach, looking at developing countries over time and comparing with one another, and then considering the consequences for the labor share of income. And to give you a sort of a preview / overview, the results are that structural change in economic policy as they've occurred since the early 1990s have failed to produce sufficient high quality jobs. And women more than men, as a result, have been crowded into low quality employment. And this is consistent with approaches that emphasize stratification and how subordinate groups face exclusion from prized economic assets like good jobs when there is a scarcity of them. And we also talk about the impact of this increased gender job segregation on the labor share of income. So it contributes to class inequality. And the challenge that we are taking up now is to generate more precision in measuring gender segregation and relative access to good jobs. So this is one of the features that motivated this work, and it looks at how women's increasing participation in the labor market or their increasing employment compares to what's happening with men. And on the horizontal axis, you have the change in men's employment rate from the early 1990s. And that is compared to the vertical axis, which is the change in women's employment relative to men's employment over the same period. Most countries are on the left side of the vertical axis, meaning women's employment has increased relative to men's employment. Um, and while meaning are above the horizontal axis. And then to the left of the vertical axis, this has happened as men's employment has been declining. So this suggests potentially a pattern whereby women's increasing employment is happening as men's employment is declining, and a potentially gender conflictual result. The percentages show the proportion of countries in each group: developed, developing, transition, in the upper left quadrant, which we think of as potentially gender conflictual. So the analytical framework that we apply to this analysis is one that combines stratification with dual labor market theory. And this was something that Stephanie touched on as well. Stratification referring to systems of structural and intentional distribution, buttressed by institutions, norms, and stereotypes that create hierarchies where some groups are identified as more deserving than others. And we combine this perspective with dual or segmented labor market theory, which posits that labor markets are segmented into a primary sector, which is characterized by having good jobs with higher wages, better benefits, internal job ladders, and a secondary, more marginal sector that is more likely to be informal, low wage, not have access to benefits. And so putting the two together, stratification and dual labor market theory, in the context of job scarcity, you get potentially job rationing and opportunity hoarding by gender, and in particular, the crowding of women into lower quality or secondary sector jobs. So the big challenge that with this work and that we're taking up currently is how to identify good jobs. And so in the context of developing countries in particular, in the first few rounds of this work, we identify women's relative access to industrial sector work as a proxy for their access to good jobs. And the argument for that is that in developing countries in particular, that jobs in the industrial sector are more likely to be formal, higher wage, and less vulnerable work than jobs in agriculture or services. So it's not necessarily that they are good jobs in the way that we think about them, but rather that they're better jobs than working in the agriculture or service sector. And this links to some of the narrative that Stephanie went over about the role of productivity enhancing structural change and development, and how that is accompanied by a shift of labor into higher productivity sectors. And that also includes increasing access to the higher paying jobs that come along with industrialization. For almost all developed and developing countries that have experienced catch-up development today, this process happens primarily through the process of industrialization. And part of the challenge that has been experienced in the neoliberal period is the challenge of premature deindustrialization, stalled industrialization, and the failure of development to generate enough good jobs. So women have been increasingly excluded from good jobs. A couple of sort of macro ways that you can consider this is the increasing failure of industrialization to the extent that it happens to generate jobs at all, and industrial sector work is declining. And women are losing relative access to industrial sector work even as their relative employment is increasing, which you can see on the right. So we were interested in looking at what kinds of macroeconomic structures and policies might impact women's relative share of industrial sector or good jobs. We include controls for structural transformation and technological change. We also include measures of the structural and policy consequences of globalization, including the extent of global integration, measures for trade policy or liberalization, and also fiscal policy stances. We control for economic growth to investigate, right, the hypothesis that economic growth generates more labor market opportunities for women. And then lastly, we also include controls for labor supply, both in terms of relative achievements in education and labor force participation. So to give you just a general summary of what the results are in terms of structural transformation and the gender inclusivity of technological change, industrialization, particularly the generation of industrial employment, improves women's access to good jobs. But a higher capital intensity of production, our proxy for technological change, may hurt this access. And Stephanie talked about this also in her presentation. Our measures for the structural and policy consequences of globalization, stronger fiscal policy stances are associated with better access to industrial employment for women. As our net exports actually enhance women's access. Did I freeze? No, okay. Growth, no association between growth and women's relative access to industrial sector jobs. And we also found that as women increase their labor force participation, their relative access to industrial sector work declines, which reflects increasing gender segregation and women being crowded into bad jobs.
Alyssa, you are at 10 minutes.
Thank you. So asking the additional question about, are men affected by this sort of gender job segregation? So what we did was we looked at how gender job segregation in terms of women's relative concentration in industrial employment, how it affects the labor share of income. And we found that a 1 standard deviation increase in women's access to good jobs was associated with a 4.7% decline in the labor share. And we hypothesize that it's women's weak remuneration and quality of work in the secondary sector relative to the primary sector that acts as a threat effect on men. Divided workers have weaker bargaining power, and this has a negative impact on the labor share of income. So the conclusion is that even though women's increasing labor force participation may be gender conflictive in terms of the circumstances they encounter in the labor market, the class dynamics are gender cooperative. I'm going to skip forward and talk about, this is the new work that we're doing, the challenge in terms of generating better measures of gender segregation and job quality. And so right now we're working with the I2D2 database. It's a World Bank data set that combines over 600 nationally representative household and labor force surveys that starts in the early 1990s. Because we're doing time series work, our sample is cut down to about 45 countries. The main challenge that we've encountered is cleaning the data essentially and making it such that we can combine these different micro data sets together. In particular, working on harmonizing the classification of economic activities across countries and time. So we started with the ISIC3 as a baseline. We have 28 sectors, agriculture, 9 industrial sectors, and 18 service sectors. We don't include agriculture in the analysis, but we can moving forward. And so our first step into this work is we've generated gender segregation indices, right, in economic activity, this standard sort of Duncan index. But we're also working on generating measures of women's relative access to good jobs. And the way that our first step into that work is to use wages as a proxy for a good job. And so the relative access of women's relative access to good jobs is a ratio of the employment share of women's good jobs to men's good jobs. And we define women's employment in good jobs as their employment in industries where women's median wage in that industry is higher than the national median wage. And we define, I have 1 minute left. I saw you unmute.
You have 1 minute left.
Thanks, Yana. I'm going to move forward and talk about how this looks. So we have some preliminary results for Latin America. Here on the horizontal axis, we have changes in the sectoral segregation, gender segregation over time between the early 1990s and the late 2000s versus women's relative access to good jobs on the vertical. And we see, I mean, this is just right, a scatter plot, but kind of, you know, as women's relative access to good jobs increases, so as you move up the vertical, the index of gender segregation declines as you move left. So that's roughly in line with what we found at the very aggregate level. But our next steps, what we're working on now is harmonization for Africa and Asia. We're almost done with Africa. We want to look to decompose the changes in these segregation indices, but also, right, the ultimate goal is to do another multivariate analysis of macro structure and policy with these more precise measures of women's relative access to good jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Excellent paper. And I wish more people were doing, you know, this amazing work on gender and the macroeconomy. It's important. And I love your results. And I'll talk a little bit more about it during the discussion time. Let's see, we are shifting now to a paper by Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University on the COVID-19 pandemic and the gender division of paid and unpaid work, evidence from India. So Ashwini, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yana, and greetings from New Delhi, India. It's very late at night for me, so apologies in advance if I, slip up on words or I'm not so sharp. This is really, 1 second, why is this not moving? So the question that I was trying to examine in this paper through data is, can pandemics or large exogenous shocks shift gendered norms in paid and unpaid work? And historically, there have been occasions where large demographic shocks have contributed to shifts in established gendered labor market norms. India, which I'm the country that I'm analyzing in this paper, itself has seen that in the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, there was a temporary increase in female labor force participation in 1921, 3 years after the flu epidemic broke out, which was mainly due to distressed labor supply by widows and by a rise in wages. And there was some data presented by LinkedIn, which is the work-related platform, which indicated something astonishing, like a 7 percentage point increase in female labor force participation rates between April and July of 2020. So there was a lot of talk of, has the pandemic finally shifted the needle on female labor force participation rate in India? And I thought that it would be a good question to examine. because even though the shock is a negative one, but perhaps it had this massive silver lining in India's context. Now, as Randy has already mentioned very excellently, and I don't have to repeat all that, which is that the economic impacts of the pandemic are gendered. So the disease also is gendered in a, not just gender, but even within women, you see differential impacts of the disease, but also the economic impacts are gendered. And so you see globally in all countries of the world, as a result of either lockdowns or stoppage of economic activity, there's been an increase in unemployment. And the early evidence from various parts of the world suggests that unlike the financial crisis induced recession, in this particular recession, more women in absolute numbers are likely to be unemployed than men globally. So, there's a bunch of papers that has come out looking at the early evidence. The US Labor Bureau statistics also show that. And all of these suggest that more women are going to be rendered jobless as a result of this recession compared to the earlier one. And the reason for that is not hard to understand. It's the nature of the pandemic and it's the reasons for the stoppage of economic activity or lockdowns, which has resulted in closure of businesses that employ large numbers of women. And these have been closed for long periods of time or are running at lower capacity. Restaurants, hospitality, beauty related industries, departmental stores, etc., and domestic workers or workers who work as nannies or au pairs or in care centers, etc., because of the social distancing norms, a lot of these workers are also have either lost their jobs or are on the verge of working less hours. And so for a variety of reasons, in this particular recession, more women are expected to lose jobs, have in fact already lost jobs more than men. So the gendered impacts are pretty clear. Now, I'm looking at data from India, this is a privately provided data source, but it is nationally representative and is the only data that's available in India right now in real time. And so it has information on employment, on hours spent on domestic work, and some data on income as well. For shortage of time, I'm not going to present the income results, but the paper is uploaded already, and that has the results on income as well. And I'd done this analysis very early on in April already, when the first round of data was available, and this particular version is an updated version of that paper, and I'm hoping to actually update it already by the end of this month when new data comes out. At some point, I'm going to stop updating and send it out for publication. But I do want to do one more revision just to see the trends. Now, unlike in parts of the world that have been discussed earlier, what needs to be understood about the Indian labor market is that there are substantial pre-existing gender gaps. So recorded female labor force participation rates are low and have been falling over the last 15 years. Now, of course, as feminist economists, we recognize that this is about paid work. And so as far as reproductive work is concerned or unpaid work is concerned, that has not fallen. But it's really paid employment or wage work. That's really where we've seen a decline in female labor force participation rates in India. And so there are pre-existing, pre-COVID, large gender disparities in labor force participation rates and employment. So as a result of that, when you looked at the first month of the lockdown, when there was the biggest job loss, in absolute numbers, more men were employed pre-COVID and more men lost jobs in the first month of the lockdown compared to women. But that just reflects the pre-existing disparities, and in a way that I'm just going to show you in a graph in a minute. This is some description of the data. This is Center for Monitoring Indian Economies, Consumer Pyramids, Household Survey data, Income Pyramids data, etc. And what is nice about this data set is that it's a panel of households and individuals, each of which is surveyed 3 times a year. So there are 3 waves per year, basically. So it's a high frequency, large panel of individuals that you can track. And so it's really useful at this time to get insights into how changes are unfolding. Um, and I'm looking at it for paid and unpaid work. I can go back, of course, to 2016, but for this particular paper, I've started in January 2019, and I have data till August 2020, unit level data. And within a couple of weeks, they will release the next wave of unit level data. So this gives me 5 waves of data, including 5 months of post-pandemic data. So that's an income. I have data only till April so far, but I'm going to increase that. So these are the 5 waves that I look at. And I can construct a pre and post-pandemic panel of individuals, which is very useful to look at the changes that we can see in paid and unpaid work. Post-pandemic, I basically have 5 months of data, which is 1 month in one wave, which is April 2020, and 4 months of wave 20, which is May to August 2020. So basically, I have 5 months of post-pandemic and everything else. But that's enough of a time period to allow us to look at the changes pre and post-COVID. Now, this is what the change in employment looks like. So the bottommost bar is the average between January 2019 and March 2020. And I also have the monthly figures for it, and there isn't a lot of month by month variation. So this annual average is actually pretty representative. And so here you already see that for 360 million men, there were 43 million women employed in the pre-pandemic period. So this is what I was talking about in the pre-existing gender gaps. And in April 2020, which was a period of a very strict lockdown in India, there was a huge contraction in employment. But you see that male employment goes down from 360 to about 256 million, and female employment goes down from 43 to 26 million. Okay, so in terms of absolute numbers, more men lost jobs. But relative to being employed previously, actually women lost jobs more. And I'm going to show that through regressions. Now, May, June, July, and August, you see a recovery in employment, both for men and women, but less so for women. And actually, the data after August, which hasn't been released to researchers yet, but this particular organization has been releasing press, has been giving out press releases. It shows that actually the recovery kind of plateaued in August. And so September, October, November, there's actually been a reversal. And so again, employment has stopped growing. And women are the worst hit in the sort of non-recovery phase as well. So in the limited 3 months or 4 months of recovery, women didn't really recover their shares. And afterwards, it's been, again, a contraction in employment. So things are not, so gender gaps have again widened. I mean, not that they ever closed, but they widened a little bit, but now they have widened back to even perhaps more than the pre-pandemic level. So certainly the first question that I was asking in the LinkedIn study, it doesn't hold up when you look at national data, which is that this particular pandemic has not been a great lever, at least as far as gender gaps is concerned. It hasn't really closed, employment probabilities for men.
Ashwini, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I'm going to skip the descriptive stats. This is just basically a pre and post differences estimation. And what this is showing is that you look at if you look at the panel on the left, then you see that the bigger decline is really male, which is the blue line. And within the male, if you look at panel B on the right-hand side, you see lower educated men have lost jobs more. These are all the informal workers. Because the strict lockdown and factories and construction activity, etc., being closed overnight, literally workers who work on the streets or are hawkers or set up small shops, factory workers, construction workers, these are all the people who suddenly were rendered jobless. And so you see lower educated men having lost jobs more substantially. This is again a more detailed graph, and I can come back to this later on. This is by marital status and children. I'm going to skip it just for the interest of time. I want to show you one more estimation, which is really like an event study kind of estimate, where I look at month by month changes. And this is actually controls for lagged employment. So it's a dynamic panel estimation with district fixed effects, because the biggest predictor of being employed in any month is whether you were employed in the previous month. And so here is where you see really the widening of the gender gap. So on the left-hand side of the event study estimates are the male, probabilities of male employment, and on the right-hand side are female. And you see that, and the base month is August 2019. As if you look at the right-hand side panel, you see that in August 2020, women were 9.5 percentage points less likely than men to be employed in August 2020 relative to August 2019. So the employment gap actually widened already by August 2020. And if descriptive data are to be believed, then it's probably widened even more. There's just one more thing that I want to talk about, which is the time spent on domestic work. And in India, my work with Naila Kabir shows that a big supply side constraint to women's participation in paid economic activity is the unequal gender division of housework in India. South Asia, within that India and Pakistan in particular, have amongst the most unequal divisions of housework. And the social norm of women being primarily responsible for domestic chores is one of the key supply side constraints. Of course, there are big demand side constraints about availability of jobs. And one of the questions that, at least in social media, came up is that is shifting through the pandemic. Because of the lockdown, men were at home and they realized that there was all this work to be done at home, and they started helping out. And so you see a lot of anecdotal evidence, sort of evidence within quotes, to show that the gender gap on domestic chores might have been closing. And so this CMI data actually just asks one simple question about how many hours do you spend on domestic work? It's just one single question. And maybe the answers, when men and women answer, they have different things in mind, but whatever it is, what we see here is that this is the panel of individuals who were surveyed in April 2020. Okay, so if you see the previous period, which is December 2019, you do see that in the strictest month of the lockdown, there was a closing of gender gap in average hours spent on domestic work. But by August 2020, when the same set of individuals were interviewed again, that gap was again re-emerging. So yes, in April, there was a little bit of a shifting of the needle, but in August already we see that it's gone back, but the male average hours are still not back to the pre-pandemic levels, and we'll have to see what happens with the next round of data. It also is a question of
Ashwini, you need to wrap up. You're at time.
Okay, all right. So it's hours spent with friends, and there's a gender gap here as well. I'll skip this slide, and I will just put up my final slide, which is about what is the what do we think is going to happen to gender gaps in paid and unpaid work as the pandemic unfolds. Will the normalization of work from home shift employers' attitudes? Will it reduce employer discrimination, etc.? All of these are open questions, but the evidence so far seems to suggest that we are not going to see an automatic or immediate reversal or a narrowing of gender gaps on all of these fronts. And so what we are saying in India is that the government needs to pay attention to the fact that the economic impact of the pandemic is not gender neutral. So we need gender disaggregated data in real time. And so unfortunately, this is the only private data source which some of us have subscribed to. So we have access to this data, but the government needs to pay attention to the gendered impacts to make sure that the already very large pre-existing gender disparities in India are already widening. And if the government doesn't step in to stall that widening, we are going to have a disastrous few years going forward in trying to reverse reverse the gender gaps that already prevent the Indian economy from attaining its full potential because of the underutilization of female talent and potential. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashwini, for your excellent presentation. And yes, I do hope that soon you will stop updating the data and publish this. I see your working paper cited all the time. It's such important work. And we really need to, see that these results published and heavily cited. So with that, we are moving on to our final paper by Chiara Piovani from the University of Denver, talking about work time matters for mental health, a gender analysis of paid and unpaid labor.
Thank you very much, Jana, and thank you for all people participating. It's very nice to see that we have a large audience and there are also many friends attending. Can you all see the slides and hear me correctly before I get going?
I do see all your slides, but also the little ones.
You're in presenter view. We see the whole presenter view.
Okay, so let me see if I can switch to the other screen. I'll try to see if I can do that fast. Otherwise, we'll have to. Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. For once, the technology was on my side. Okay. All right. This project is co-authored with Nursel Diner Afzar and is an ongoing project. So here I'm going to provide a sense of the work that we have been doing and share some results that we think are quite interesting as a starting point for a conversation. Now, first of all, a brief roadmap to get a sense of the flow of this presentation. I'm going briefly to go over some background and context to get a sense of the reasons that motivated this project. Then I'll provide a brief overview of the interplay between the economy and mental health to get a sense of what the literature has been saying on this and how gender has been understood in this context. Then I'll move to the conceptual foundations of our analysis, and especially we wanted to point out some hypotheses that can explain the interaction between work time and mental health. Then I'll move to the empirical analysis, providing a sense of the empirical approach and results that we have been obtaining, and then finally some concluding thoughts. Now, in this project, we wanted to look at how work time has been impacting mental health, starting from a well-established evidence on how mental health has been interacting with economic outcomes. If we look at statistics on the incidence of mental health problems, we see that over the last few decades, there has been a very rapid increase, especially when it is about anxiety and depression. That is in the US, but also all over the world. And it is also interesting that for a very long time, mental health has actually been neglected. It is only at the beginning of this century that the World Health Organization officially actually recognized that the mental health is a core component of social welfare and that health shouldn't simply be identified with physical health, but mental health matters as well. Now, if we look at the data for the United States, we see the mental illness is really quite widespread, with a greater incidence among women than men. Globally as well, women tend to report a greater mental health, a greater incidence of mental health problems. It is important to point out in this context that when we look at the mental health data, they tend to be self-reported data. And so there is also to keep into account that the greater incidence among women may also be related to a greater willingness by women to recognize or discuss certain concerns. When the literature started to talk about the influence of economic factors on mental health, we see the first contributions in the context of the Great Depression. And it is the work of social psychologists first that identified how certain economic factors, and in particular unemployment, can affect the development of various mental health problems, anxiety, depression, suicide, and other forms of psychological distress. If we look at the literature, it is especially after the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009 that there has been an intensification of empirical contributions in the US, but in other parts of the world as well. And there has been also growing interest in understanding not simply how unemployment impacts mental health, but also how other economic variables, including poverty, inequality, household debt, may impact the different forms of mental health problems. When we look at the gender analysis, however, of the interaction between mental health and economy, there is still a limited amount of work. Now, moving to the conceptual understanding of the interplay between economy and mental health, after the contributions in the context of the Great Depression, we jump actually to the 80s, when we see the development of what are considered to be the foundational models to understand the interaction between the economy and mental health. We don't really have the time here to enter into details, but there are different channels that are identified as the mediating factors explaining how the economy, and especially employment or the lack of employment, can impact mental health. It is interesting to move to how the World Health Organization has understood the role of socioeconomic factors in explaining mental health. After the Great Recession, in 2011, the WHO released a report in which includes a comprehensive account of the different socioeconomic factors that can affect the mental health, dividing the factors among protective and risk factors. It is interesting, if we look at risk factors, that not only unemployment is seen as a component, as a risk factor of mental health problems, but also certain jobs characteristics, indicating essentially that employment by itself is not sufficient as a protective factor, but certain job characteristics actually can be detrimental for mental health. So job insecurity and job stress are seen as important risk economic factors. What about gender in the interaction between the economy and mental health? For a very long time, while social psychologists try to understand how the economy affects mental health, there has been a complete neglect of gender because of the dominant breadwinner model that relegated women to the sphere of the household, which was defined as non-economically relevant. It is only starting from the 80s, instead, when women started to be more active participants in the labor market, the scholars started to consider also gender, and in the basic form of looking at how men and women can be affected by the economy. The literature, however, remains quite limited. Here I provide, however, a sense of the different interpretations that have been proposed in the literature to understand how gender can mediate the interaction between the economy and mental health. So gender can matter because of widespread inequalities that we see in economic outcomes, how women still play a dominant role in unpaid work with respect to the paid sphere of the economy. Women still face barriers in accessing decision-making positions, and there are still widespread wage disparities. A typical view that has been proposed in the literature also considers that men and women may experience the paid and unpaid sphere of the economy differently, claiming that men and women, because of socialization, may associate with paid and unpaid work different meanings, claiming that men have are more socialized to be providers, and women instead are more socialized to be nurturers. And so employed married women are more likely to experience guilt and distress with respect to men when they experience role conflicts. A competing view instead claims that is the quality of roles that matters. It is not simply a matter of who is in charge of what and who is doing what, but also the experience and the characteristics associated to different roles. Finally, there is another interpretation that has been released more recently that considers the importance of looking at the gender regime that applies to different countries. So essentially looking at the degree of gender parity that is embedded in institutions and in the functioning of the society. Now, if we look at the contributions that have been proposed looking at the interaction between the economy and mental health, there is still very limited research on how specifically work time can impact mental health. There are some empirical papers that have been released over the last few years, but there has been still very, very limited work, also because of data constraints. But this is something that is important, especially in light of differences in paid and unpaid work that is done by men and women, and also looking at the position of the US internationally when it is about amount of work time. So here, just briefly,
10 minutes, you have 5 minutes left.
So just briefly, some data. We are all very aware of these statistics, but just to get a sense of how women tend to be more represented in part-time with respect to full-time. Women are also more in charge of unpaid work with respect to men. These applied to the United States, which is a case study of this project. And then also, if we look at the amount of work hours reported by the United States, we see that the United States tends to be a very hard-working nation compared with the average of OECD countries. So especially in the United States, that over the last 40 years, also in the context of stagnant wages, has seen a rapid increase in work hours. It is important to understand how work time impacts mental health. Paid work and unpaid work can both have a positive and negative effects on mental health, but we make the claim, we state the hypothesis, that after a certain limit, a scarcity time effect may be dominant, considering time as a health resource as well. So excessive work time, either paid or unpaid, can cut into personal time for care and development, and that can be detrimental for mental health. And especially if we combine paid and unpaid work, then there can be a greater potential for competing demands and role overload. In terms of empirical analysis, we are using the latest data available for this type of project, which still dates at 2013 and 2014. We are looking at individuals that are above 39 years old, and our key variable is defined here as a demand. How strongly do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements? The demands of everyday life often gets me down, and individuals are provided with different options. And we see that 34% of the women report that they strongly agree, they agree a lot, or they agree a little with demand. And we created therefore a categorical variable in which we consider one as people who agree strongly, to agree a little, and 0 otherwise. And men report 23% to agree strongly, to agree a little. We consider paid work and unpaid work, and paid work refers to work at primary job and other jobs, and unpaid work refers to unpaid assistance, given that we are considering individuals who are above 39 years old. When we look at unpaid work, we include assistance to parents, in-laws, children and grandchildren, and also household chores. We use a logistic.
We have a minute left. If you can wrap it up, please.
Yeah. We use a logistic regression model. We wanted to understand indeed how work time and also considering separately paid work time and unpaid work time impact mental health. We consider a series of control variables, which are pretty standard in the literature. So I jump into the results quickly. The coefficients cannot be evaluated yet in the current form, so I'll focus on the significance. What is interesting is that if we consider the entire sample, we see the total work time is significant for emotional distress, what I defined as a demand. So an increase in total work time increases the likelihood that people experience mental, emotional distress, and women have an especially higher likelihood. When we divide total work time in paid work and unpaid work, we see that paid work is not significant, and unpaid work is significant at 10%, with women once again reporting a higher likelihood of developing emotional distress, and also the variable female is significant in this regression as well. Now, we separated the sample in men versus women. And what is interesting is that when we run regressions for men, considering total work time and then separating paid and unpaid work, the regression is not significant. So work time is not a significant variable impacting mental distress for men. However, when we are looking at women alone, we see the total work time is in fact significant. So an increase in total work time increases the likelihood of mental distress for women. And when we separate paid work and unpaid work, is actually unpaid work that shows to be significant. So an increase in unpaid work increases the likelihood of mental distress. So to conclude, time use matters for mental health. It is important to examine the impact of work time by gender. And what we find especially interesting, it is actually unpaid and not paid work that affects women's emotional distress, which indicates the importance of addressing the traditional gender division of labor, and using this as a foundation also to inform appropriate social and labor policies. Thank you. I'll stop here.
All right, thank you for your excellent work on how unpaid work and paid work affects men's and women's mental health, especially women's mental health, and the hugely important implications for the gender division of labor in the household. So if you can end your screen share.
Sure.
We are now moving on to our section of the program where each author will discuss a pre-assigned paper. So we are going to start with Randy, who is discussing Stephanie's paper.
Okay, well, since this is already almost published, Stephanie, I'm not going to make recommendations for how you might make it better or change it. Congratulations. The last story you told, I think, is where I'll jump off, which is I tend to think of industrial policy as this, conflagration of labor markets, development, and macroeconomic policy. And if you think about it like that, labor economics and certainly development economics, and to some degree, thanks to you all, macroeconomics has these gender components. I mean, it's pretty clear that gender matters in all of them. It's kind of striking that in industrial policy, it's not, you know, it was sort of an afterthought. It makes me think this is why I never go into economics now. So, right, you know, so 30, 40 years of sort of trying to think about this stuff, and here is industrial policy not thinking about it. So, I mean, I guess mostly what I'll do is just, you know, summarize or praise or link together some of all the papers in the sense of the contributions. So, you know, this notion of using feminist economic analysis around social reproduction, stratification economics, et cetera, to tell your story, I found compelling. And I'm not, the only industrial policy literature I'm more familiar with is the varieties of capitalism literature. And I don't know, I mean, I think they're a little bit better, but maybe not. But I actually think they pay more attention to the feedback loop back to policy. That is, what you talk about, and it's really useful, is that industrial policies can enhance or impede gender equality. And gender inequality can enhance or impede industrial policies. But my sense also is that the degree to which women are integrated or not also influences a larger notion of what the state does and what it doesn't do. In the same way that you talked about the IT sector, or, you know, the development of knowledge. If you don't have women talking about the development of knowledge, you're not going to have women in that knowledge, right, or in the use of that knowledge. And it seems to me also that the degree to which, you know, a family wage type model develops, or this notion of a exploitative subaltern group of both men and women develops, also affects the state and how the state then reacts to either reproduce that and probably mostly to reproduce that. So that's sort of one feedback loop. I mean, it's the one I think a lot about in terms of gender and race in the United States. That is, the development of our social welfare state is highly influenced by racial and gendered relationships. And I would assume that's true in developing states too. So I guess, and maybe some of the work you're doing now, you know, that Alyssa presented, is beginning to think about that feedback loop. That is, how is this inequality then shaping or keeping the state from shaping itself in ways that would enhance growth? There's, we know discrimination at the firm level is inefficient. Well, it's pretty inefficient probably at the state macro level as well. So anyway, so I'll stop there as just sort of a way to, you know, I don't want you to change your proofs. Because that's what I said. So congratulations on publishing it. I'm glad that they came to their senses. And thanks for your work.
Thank you, Randy. Stephanie, would you like to respond before you give your comments on Ashwini's paper?
Sure. Thanks for that. First of all, we are going to turn it into a journal article. So any comments you have for a revision would be welcome. You know, so I think for me, one of the things that comes out of this is that even this kind of policy, industrial policy, has distributional effects, just as we now deeply understand that macroeconomic policy does. And so that for me was really illuminating to do in this particular paper. And as you said, it's really the role of the state that mediates between the private sector's adoption of technology, at every level, at the research level, the product development, and so forth, that the state mediates between distribution and the behavior of the private sector. And, you know, I've said this before, and I think that for me, that's a succinct way of saying it, that the role of the state should be to incentivize private firms to align their profit motives with social well-being. And that means that any set of policies, you have to define what your policy goals are. So industrial policy, it's not just enough to say it raises productivity. It has to be that we're more specific. Does it reduce the uncared paid burden? Does it, you know, I mean, so many other goals that we have to articulate. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in talking about COVID policies in Vermont, for example, has been to talk to legislators about what are your goals coming out of this crisis. That needs to inform your policies. And one of those goals has to be a reduction of inequality and a greener economy, for example. So I think that starting with those goals up front helps to define the policy, and the state can play that role. But I really like your comment, Randy, about the welfare, the state itself, the degree of inequality, the prior degree of inequality shapes the role that the state will take. And that's really where we can have an impact as feminist economists, as anti-racist economists, and so forth, is to influence the development of state policy around those issues. So I appreciate that. And Yana, I also see a question from Karen that's related, but I can wait if you prefer that I do that.
Oh, you can go on if it's related. Go ahead.
Karen asked this question that really plagued me and has plagued me for a long time. And that is, what she says is, I wonder if the focus on industrialization should be nuanced a bit. Many economists are going straight to service-based economies and skipping manufacturing, which is likely to be a smaller share of output. Now, there is no doubt that that is true. And I have a close friend who is a Cuban economist, and we talked about writing a paper in which Cuba leapfrogged from an agricultural economy, skipped manufacturing, and went to a very high skill service sector economy in terms of health and knowledge production and so forth, with all of its attendant problems related to the embargo and so forth. And I think it's worth considering that. But I think that the literature, that what we understand theoretically about the role of industrialization, and by industrialization, I don't mean just producing, material consumer goods. I mean like producing solar panels, solving our, weatherization materials, for example, that solve our green energy problems are deeply important. And poor countries that are dependent upon rich countries are locked in this thing of exporting labor-intensive goods and importing high-value goods whose prices rise over time, whereas poor countries are locked into producing those goods that are homogeneous and whose prices don't rise over time. And that isn't just agricultural goods; it's now low-wage, labor-intensive goods. So I think that we have to rethink. We have to continue to accept the lessons we've learned from structural macroeconomists and apply it. I don't entirely disagree with you, Karen, and it's made me think that I actually really want to write another paper to try to think this through. But I do think that poor countries that move into services and skip this stage of production of technologically intensive goods find themselves at a disadvantage in the global economy. Because of the structure of that economy and the monopolies that exist, the global commodity chains that exist, which are dominated by buyer-driven firms and producer-driven firms in rich countries. So I think they remain locked in poverty. And again, I think then rethinking the role of the state in that process is really the fundamental piece around industrial policy. And I really thank you for that comment, Randy, that's really kind of centralizes that issue. Thanks.
And Stephanie, you are a discussant for Ashwini's paper.
All right. I feel like I'm having to work hard today instead of just watching sessions. So I think that this was so interesting to me, and Ashwini, this harkened back to some of the lessons that we learned from the Great Recession, which is that initially it was called a man session. And we later understood that the trajectory of the recession actually resulted in women being negatively affected, in part due to the impact of austerity policies after the initial stimulus packages that in particular disadvantaged women because of where the cuts were. And so I think that one of the things that would be beneficial to understand more in this paper, and maybe in a separate paper, thinking about it is, what are the factors? What are the causal mechanisms by which we get these changes in the employment effects of the COVID crisis? From April to May to June to August and so on and so forth. To what extent was it due to macro level policies on lockdowns that influence some industries more than others, or macro level policy in terms of fiscal policy and COVID, COVID strategies, stimulus packages, for example. So I think delineating that a bit more would be helpful. And I think a comparison with the Great Recession literature, I think of Jill Rubery's book with Maria Caravazzini as a good place to look. I think it's an area for us to develop as feminist economists about the undulating phenomenon of gender disparities in the process of a crisis, that there is no unique relationship between gender inequality, but rather that relationship changes at different moments because of different factors. And that will help us think about what the policy solutions to this might be. The other thing I want to just highlight for folks is the effects on household labor. And again, this is like really an interesting area. Like, why is the effect temporary in terms of men and men taking on more unpaid work at home? And I think of, for example, World War II, in which my aunts, for example, left the farm and became mechanical engineers on airplanes, and then lost their jobs right after the war because men came back and took those jobs. What is it that allows gender norms and stereotypes to change in a stable way, that is to persist, rather than simply be a temporary disruption in long-held gender norms and stereotypes? And in this, I think, again, that feminist economists really would benefit from engaging with social psychologists, people like Cecilia Ridgway, but also, oh my God, I think it's Andrea Eagly is her last name, E-A-G-L-Y. I think it's Andrea, who talks about dynamic norms and stereotypes, because I think this is such a fundamental phenomenon. It's the glue to stratification, especially gender stratification. And so understanding that these norms can be temporarily disrupted is a good thing, but we don't yet understand what would make that disruption persist over time to a permanent change that leads to greater gender equality. And Eagly has written on this topic about the fact that norms and stereotypes actually are not stable over time. We tend to think of them as just attitudes that are held for hundreds of years, but they do change. And you provide evidence of that, Ashwini, in a way, right? I mean, I don't know if, yeah, I would say at least temporarily norms and stereotypes changed a bit. So the question is how to cause those to persist more over time. And again, I think it's a deep area for us as feminist economists to engage, especially with sociologists and social psychologists. I thought it was really great work. And as I said, I think the one thing that would be really awesome is to compare this to the Great Recession literature. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Ashwini, would you like to respond to Stephanie and then give your comments on Chiara's paper?
Thanks, Stephanie, thank you very much. And if you could just send me these references in an email that you have recommended today, that'll be really great, actually. I'll follow them up. In terms of the causal mechanisms, what happened in India in April, it was one of the strictest lockdowns anywhere in the world. I mean, literally overnight, the Prime Minister said the country is shutting down. And migrant labor, I don't know, you might have seen pictures of thousands of migrant laborers walking back to their villages because factories and everything just shut overnight, right? So there wasn't any change. So that's why I think causal is because it is the lockdown, that nothing else changed really, So in the paper, I can include more discussion on the types of industries, but it was really daily wages and all the industries that were affected by the lockdown, so it's really in 1 month, nothing else changed. So, but now since I'll be looking at the January panel, and I promise I would stop after that, I'll have a few months to look at the changes, and then that's it. Because otherwise every 3 months there's new data and then I can't stop. In terms of the household labor, I absolutely agree that norms can change. In fact, even in India, they have changed. I mean, we do see changes, it's not a homogeneous, unchanging, fixed, static kind of a society at all. There's been a lot of change. It's possible that some of this will stick. I think the reason that you see this big change in April is because the Indian middle class households work with domestic helpers. That's just the way life is organized in India, right? So what happened in April was because the lockdown was so strict, even domestic workers couldn't go to their place of work. And so there wasn't, the gardeners and the cooks and the cleaners and, everything, car cleaners, all of this stuff. Middle class households had to do them on their own, So that's the reason why you see this big increase in male hours of domestic work in April. By the time August comes around, one, many offices have reopened, so men are going back to work. Secondly, domestic workers are back working in the homes, right? And so even female hours, you sort of go back to business as usual, but it is, at least in terms of conversation in India, there is now a much greater conversation about sharing the load. And so that's, I think, that there is, I mean, maybe it's urban, maybe it's not going to be whatever, but that's fine. I mean, things always change, always begins from certain quarters. And I think that's it. So, but at least the conversation about reproductive labor or the drudgery of domestic chores and the need to share it, I think that conversation has started in a more significant way, just outside drawing rooms, etc. Right? So I don't know. I mean, I think that norms can change, and events such as these can. But I'll definitely look at Eagly's book on the dynamics of what causes norms change. So thank you. But do please send me an email with the other references. I will include those. Chiara, I didn't get to read your paper, so my comments are very brief. Also, I'm not an expert on mental health, so I really don't know the literature on that. Just a few points about when you develop the paper. So I think there are your regressions at the end are more about stress than about the earlier slides when you talk about diseases like schizophrenia, etc. So it's all mental health, I understand, but I think there are different dimensions of mental health. So I think that you need to separate the two out, because in terms of the risk factors and the protective factors, I think when you look at diseases such as schizophrenia or I think they are less, and this is my layperson's understanding, is that these factors might be less salient in terms of chemical imbalances that cause all kinds of behavioral issues, etc., relative to stress, because your final regression is really about stress. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that I think you should interact female with all your work dummies, because the point is that anybody who works controlling for everything else, if you have to work more in a job that is full of drudgery or is high pressure, it's going to worsen mental health. But does do so differentially for women? You can only get that by looking at a difference. I know that it's one point in time, right? It's not, you don't have time data over time. It's just one point in time. So in that, you should include an interaction term for female. And my third point was about, I was curious about why you linked the breadwinner model to Keynesianism in one of your slides, because the male breadwinner idea goes back far, way before Keynes, so the Industrial Revolution, or even pre-Industrial Revolution, in fact. And so I was just curious about why you would associate that with Keynesianism. So yeah, that's just a larger point. So just these are my 3 points.
Thank you very much, Ashwini. This is very, very helpful. Just a quick response. In terms of mental health that we are looking, there are many different dimensions that can be considered, and there can be severe mental health problems from distinguished from more frequent types of anxiety, depression, or as you call it, stress. And we saw before in one of the slides, indeed, that anxiety and depression are the two dominant forms. So by looking at the emotional distress, I was trying essentially to catch a more widespread type of phenomenon with respect to mental health diseases, essentially. But I can frame the discussion a little bit more precisely in the paper. When we are looking at the framework by the WHO, considers indeed mental health considered as a whole, and not simply also as the absence of a mental health problems, but as the fulfillment of capabilities and living a healthy life all rounded. So I think that there is a space to address what you're saying to make it consistent with the analysis. In terms of the interaction term, we did consider that. Now there is a fundamental problem that we found in this data set and also in previous data sets that we use for other projects on a related topic. And the problem is the self-reported information. So when we use the interactive term, we end up getting some results that are a little inconsistent, and this is why we decided to separate men and women in the analysis in order to see how the regression affects the outcome for men and women considered separately. So we hoped to be able to address your concern in that manner. In terms of the breadwinner model and Keynesianism, basically what I was trying to say is that as long as women were not a significant component of the labor force, and the literature there has been neglect of the specific impact of mental or the specific impact of economic outcomes on women. So until the 80s, and that's what I call Keynesianism, essentially, women has been neglected, and I interpreted this as essentially the persistence of the idea that women are a secondary, represent secondary workers until then. That was the way in which I consider it, essentially. I don't know if I'm responding sufficiently to your questions, Ashwini, but these are my points. Yana, do you want me to quickly, I guess, provide some? Yes, so we have just a few minutes. Well, thank you very much, Randy, for the opportunity to read your paper. As always, I find your work very, very interesting. And even if you indicated the paper is still in a draft form, it was very engaging. I have mostly questions. As a follow-up, I'll just very briefly indicate some comments. I found especially interesting the consideration of various forms of gender inequalities indicated in your paper, in the sense that by now we know that in the context of the global pandemic, women have experienced a heavier burden than men. And even the New York Times recently indicated that women have stepped back by 10 years in the labor force because of all the extra heavy burden associated with household responsibilities. But it is also important to look at differentiation within women. So to look also at how age, marital status, class, race, ethnicity can play out in explaining the impact of the pandemic, especially in the context of the US. Randy indeed points out the need to look specifically at race in addition to other dimensions of inequality. And this is also very important in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've been observing over the last few months. And especially to help bring out also important forms of inequalities that have been increasing well before the pandemic, and they've been exacerbated by the pandemic. So in this context, I would like to ask, do you think the pandemic could create the policy space to finally recognize the role that reproductive work plays in our society and lead to more structural measures in support of women and families as a whole? And this is in a way consistent with what Stephanie was indicating before, whether actually there can be long-lasting changes and not simply some short-run responses to the crisis. So essentially, the question is, can we hope for a shift away from neoliberalism as an outcome of the pandemic? And this is especially important given that we had another important crisis in 2008 and 2009, and we had a very short-lived revival of Keynesianism, and then we returned to business as usual. So to what degree you think the current crisis can actually represent the final trigger point for a more fundamental change? And then finally, in regard to the systemic racial inequality that has become such an important discussion in the US in the context of Black Lives Matter, what do you think are the prospects that the new US administration can do something substantial in favor of social justice?
Okay, thank you, Chiara. Randy, if you can answer the questions briefly and allow a few minutes for Alyssa also.
I'm not optimistic. I guess I'm too old now to be optimistic. Although, I mean, I think having a new word about essential is actually really good. I mean, we all face a pandemic, but people faced it really differently, and especially women. And I do think the stuff around Black Lives Matter is incredibly important and enthusiastic, but changing systemic racism or systemic sexism is really hard. And also the discussion has focused on criminal justice, which I think is great, but it hasn't focused on anti-poverty programs. It hasn't focused on making good jobs better. And so I think we have to make that change. So if it's going to change, it's going to change because people make it. Of course, I mean, I can't wait till January 20th. I mean, finally we will have a president that has been elected, and I think we'll begin to address some of this. I don't think though I think we'll see some incremental change. I think we're going to see some positive change on paid family leave. I think we'll see some positive change around some labor standards. But in terms of addressing some of the issues that came out in COVID, I mean, we've seen them now, we've been exposed, but there's no vaccine for this, as people have said. And so I like to be hopeful. But, I think that, my list of policies, it's the same list I've had for a long time. We just see them differently. So I'll stop there and let there be more discussion.
Thank you, Randy. Alyssa, I loved your presentation. I'd love to read the full paper, which I didn't. And I do have one question for you. For your regression analysis, where you looked at the relationship between women's labor share and income and their share of good jobs, I'm paraphrasing. I was wondering if you've done any kind of strategies to try to be able to pinpoint causality in a way that would, satisfy reviewers at the economics journals that are always looking for those methods, or if it really is just an association where there's just no variables, let's say, to do an instrumental variable approach or anything like that. So that's my question. And I know you have a couple of remarks on the other papers in our closing minutes.
I do. So I had a question. So just to respond to your question about causality, briefly, we didn't do it in the development and change paper, but this is part of our as we turn to the micro data and able to do more, sort of control and time series, we will be able to address that more directly. But it's partly about and I know Stephanie's talked a lot about this too, and you're generally facing this with doing macro level work. It's much harder to establish causality. I just saw the 3-minute remaining, and I think if it's like the other sessions, we're just going to turn off in 3 minutes. So I'm going to move on because there are a couple other things I wanted to say. So one was about Karen's comment on industrial policy and moving away from it. And I think, right, one of the themes that we talk about in the paper is how for most developing countries, the services sector has played the role of being residual unemployment, right, as opposed to a prospect for leapfrogging. And that's something that macroeconomists need to do a lot more work on, is understanding how service sector growth contributes to productivity growth and development. And I think an area that is ripe for involvement among feminist economists is how fiscal spending on care or reproductive work plays into that process, right? There's been a lot of work, I think Tom Masterson is here, he's made contributions to that on how, fiscal spending on care work generates much more jobs and many more multiplier effects than fiscal spending on infrastructure kind of investment. But what we don't know is what is its impact then on consequent processes of productivity growth. The other last thing I wanted to say is a little seed. I think some of the resistance in the heterodoxy to gender and industrial policy, part of it is old-fashioned gender bias, but at least at international institutions, it's also been linked with how gender equality has become sort of a Trojan horse for marketization and liberalization. Right, and so at the IMF, every international institution is talking about getting women more involved in financial markets, labor markets, and so in that sense, there is that suspicion which is deserved, and I think that that's another aspect of resistance. Are they going to cut us off in moments? The other thing I'll email this, but bye everyone.